they we want to make sure that they are involved too. Fantastic. Okay, I am so excited for Dennis, Dr. Dirk Matt. So he is a forensic anthropologist, but he is at Mercyhurst University in Pennsylvania, and he is the expert. He's been running the program there for eons, it seems like, but he's the guy who's been on A&E series. He's had National Geographic specials, MSNBC. He's done some really fascinating things. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Dennis. What I do want you all to know, feel free to write questions in the chat if you want. I'd like to hold the questions until the end of his presentation, unless Dennis, you want to do something different, but I think that might be the most organized way to do that. So okay, we will go ahead and get started then. Thank you all for being here.
And I'll just say,
oh yes,
Amanda is going to be running the show today, so I may drop in from time to time, but it's good to see everybody. And now I'm going to go distract the kids for multiple hours.
That's right. And so Luke's a science fiction and fantasy guy, and I am like, give me as many thrillers as possible. So we're dividing and conquering in our various areas of interest. So, okay. All right, Dennis.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Well, it depends, I guess, where you are, but here in Erie, it's about 11:30. So sitting in my office here at Mercyhurst University. And what we're going to talk about today is forensic anthropology. So I'm not quite sure how forensic anthropology has been, or what you think of it these days, or what it's about. You know, it's a little more popular on TV. There's that show Bones, not that I've ever watched that or anything like that, but there are some recent presentations of forensic anthropology. So I will have to say that that's not quite how I see the field. And so we'll talk about that. I think historically, and what people think about now when they think about forensic anthropology, it is the individuals that know about human bones. And so if there is a case out in the woods, they find some bones, it'll go through the cops, will recover it. It may go through the forensic pathologist, and then if there's issues and trying to figure out who it is, then you send it along to the forensic anthropologist, who's an expert in extracting from the bones, whether this is a male or a female, how tall they might have been, what's the sex, what's et cetera, all that information. I think that is the common concept of what the forensic anthropologist does, you know, the experts in bones. I do that. We do a lot of that, but also we're experts in animal bones. And that, say, why is that relevant? Well, it's probably, well, I'll say that we do about 120 cases, forensic cases here a year that pass through my office here. The vast majority of those are police texting me or writing me and saying, can you tell me what these bones are? You know, they're at a scene, they're looking at a whole bone or a scrap of bone and trying to figure out whether this is human or not, because that's pretty important. If it's not human, then they move on and, you know, they discard the bone, etc. So we're also experts at identifying animal bones. So yes, we know a great deal about bones, and I think we're the best at trying to figure out from this skeleton, from this partial skeleton, from this skeleton that's been in a fire and highly altered, you know, what is the biological profile of this individual, so that maybe eventually can get the person identified, which is typically through dental, or nowadays a lot of it is through DNA. So most of the, if you attended some other talk by a forensic anthropologist, they may spend their hour talking about how yes, we can look at the pelvis, and we can go to the pubic symphysis and understand the morphology there, and it'll tell us that we likely have a male or a female, or that it's, you know, somebody 30 to 50, etc. Okay, yeah, we're pretty good at that, but that's, you know, from your perspective, that's pretty boring right now. That's not what you need. What I've done over the years is my training is in not only the bones. I'm a physical anthropologist. That's where I got my training, have my PhD in physical anthropology, but I also have training in archaeology. And so that's come into play when we deal with outdoor crime scenes and the police call us into it and ask us to assist them in the recovery. If I'm just an expert in bones, then I can go to the scene and say, yes, that's a human femur, and then I put it in my bag and said, oh, there's some other bones, and put it in the bag. However, I will lose information on basically the context of those bones. And so when we go back on that, and there is a question of, you know, what's going on in the past there, we've lost that information. I always go to what the police do at an indoor scene, and they have an indoor scene, and they would never just go in and take a few pictures and then start collecting the evidence and putting it in a bag. They are involved in documenting very carefully where all that evidence is, don't move it, and try to understand how it's relevant, not only to the scene there, but also to the incident, the death event that occurred there. And so that's how they approach it. And it's not, ultimately, the goal isn't just to find the body and identify who that is. For the police, when they process an indoor scene, it is what happened here in great detail, because ultimately if some other human being had something to do with it, they want to charge them. They're going to present it in court and say, I have evidence to back up, this is what you did at this particular incident, this was your role, etc. And so it's not an effort of just taking things out of context and then assuming that you'll get it into court and you know, get a conviction. And so, however, at the outdoor scene, the police are called in, and you would think that that would be the expectation, that not just to find some bones, find some evidence, put it in the bag, and then go to the coroner's office as quickly as possible. Their goal still is to figure out what happened in the past. However, their training, their familiarity is not with you know, branches and leaf litter and things like that, and buried bodies and etc. So they're sort of at a loss, and they haven't had that training. And so in the past, what would happen is that they would just take pictures and then collect it. And so it was out of context. And so there was really no attempt to figure out exactly what happened, because they didn't have the information there. It always really gets me mad when I see cases on the news and they say, well, this guy may have been a serial killer, and he buried his victims in the backyard. And then what happens is you see a backhoe digging it up. That, for me, is very disrespectful to the evidence. It's disrespectful to our discipline, that we know that we can collect evidence there, and maybe criminal charges should be brought against that backhoe operator doing that. No, anyway, but yes. And I think the assumption is that there is, you're dealing with an outdoor scene, and it's been rained upon, the animals have had access to it, so it's a highly disturbed. So why waste our time trying to figure out what's going on there? Because it's, you know, it's unattainable. When in reality, we can gather a lot of information from that scene and reconstruct the past. And what it requires is the application of archaeology, forensic archaeology, we call it. And so if we do that, we approach the scene very carefully. We document everything in its place. We document the scene. we document where things are positioned and oriented, then we can go back and figure out what happened. If we have an understanding of the natural environment and how nature, how animals, how soil pH, how the shade, how all these things impact our evidence, then we can reconstruct a very good story of what happened in the past. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been in the business for 30 years now. Done probably 1,000 forensic anthropology cases, and they range from surface scattered to buried body, to fatal fire scenes, to mass disaster scenes. I was involved with the Flight 93 recovery there in Somerset. I was in charge of the recovery of the remains from the crash in Buffalo in 2009. And so we were able to show that approach, that forensic anthropological, forensic archaeological approach works very well. And we can collect that evidence, and we can collect it so that it is court ready and it is accepted. And I guess the main thing is that it is scientific. And that's what I've tried to bring to the discipline, that forensic archaeology and the processing of outdoor scenes is done scientifically. And then we can help, quote unquote, solve some of the cases. We this last week we were involved with a case in New York, in Portland, New York, just over the border here, in which there were some remains found by a citizen. We were called in to process that, to use all the protocols, and for that we're trying to figure out, not just collect the skull that was found there and say, okay, we can tell maybe it's potentially a white female of 30 to 50, et cetera, but we're trying to figure out how long ago that occurred. What was it? Was it a buried feature? What type of tool was used to do that? Was there any other evidence left in there? The fact that we don't see much in the way of clothing, is that an artifact of being in the ground for so long, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much more than just looking at the bones. While we did that, I have a graduate program here, and the graduate students do everything with us. That's part of their training. And so some of them said, well, I smell decomp. They smelled what they interpreted as human decomposition. I said, well, we have a set of remains here that have no more tissue, so I don't know how you would smell that. And so I sort of disregarded it, but as it turns out, there was a bag about 25 feet away, and when the police opened it, it was another set of human remains. So that was a first time in our career, but we were prepared. And what we're trying to do with that is, what is the relationship between those two in terms of time and space and things like that, and as well as get information on each of those individually, of ultimately who it is, how long ago, and then how were they placed in the grave, maybe some indication of how they died, et cetera. And so for me, the field of forensic anthropology is no longer just the bones. We're not just the bones. It is more or less looking at how we get into the forensic situations, the cases. We're called by the police, and they have certain expectations of us. If we were to go there and say, oh, there's a skull, and we pick it out of the ground and said, I'm heading back to the lab, then we're going to do them a disservice. That's not what they want. They want to answer a whole series of questions that they have, that they believe they don't have the training to address properly, that would stand up in court. And so for me, that is what is forensic anthropology. And I guess from your point of view as mystery writers, et cetera, the story is the interesting part and what we can do. So I've prepared a little PowerPoint that will talk about, you know, what we do in forensic anthropology in that new perspective. I've called it a paradigm shift in how we approach the field. So I will show you that PowerPoint, and I'll go over parts of a forensic case and show you how we demonstrate it. If you're a bit squeamish, then you may want to avert your eyes, but showing some remains of the recently deceased. So, okay, I will share the screen here. Okay, is that good? Everybody can see it?
Yes,
Okay.
you can see that.
Okay. So in the last few years of my career here, probably the last 10 years, well, throughout my 30 years, I've been trying to convince forensic anthropologists that forensic archaeology is a very important part of it. We can't just get a box of bones and get everything out of it. We're going to miss information, and it's out of context, and so it's not particularly scientific. So my proselytizing over the last 30 years has been about forensic archaeology. I also include there this word forensic taphonomy that we will have to explain, and in reality, that is basically what we're doing. When the police and the coroner say, can you come to the scene and assist us, then what we're doing is forensic taphonomy. So we'll talk about that. The key thing for me over the last few years has been the forensic archaeology. And it is when remains are found in these situations, whether it's a surface scatter, whether it's a buried body, a fatal fire, you know, even a mass disaster incident. We have the skills to assist the police who are not familiar with these types of situations. You know, so you can see in this figure here, if you can see my my pointer here, we have an individual who's laying out in the woods. And for the police, we can't just take pictures and collect it. They're asking, you know, it's covered in leaf litter. Is that important? You know, it looks like there may be some remains that are lost. How are we going to recover that? So we will say, yes, that is important. For example, the leaf litter here in this individual is important because it provides a rough estimate of when that body was deposited on the surface. If it was deposited in the winter and we're in the spring, we don't expect in a deciduous forest to have leaf litter on it. But if this body we find in the spring shows a layer of leaf litter, then it was likely deposited sometime before the previous fall. So we have a little window of the postmortem interval, the PMI. So we as forensic anthropologists, and we're utilizing forensic archaeology, we understand the relevance of the associated evidence there, that in fact, the leaf litter does provide us with some information. The soil pH levels gives us information. The fact that we're in a shaded area, we're on a slope, et cetera. All that plays an important role in how we interpret this scene. I include in here the backhoe, but we don't want that. And so a general protocol for how we approach the scene is that we will, in a forested situation, we will clean the scene of the overlying leaf litter and other things, but understanding the relevance of it so that we can expose any other evidence associated with our set of remains. And we'll also be able to see the surface to have an idea of why, if some remains are moved out of position, why that is, because that we have to try to explain that. You can see in this situation, it's the remains are still relatively intact, even though we have some bones exposed and it's been on the surface for a period of time. Some of those remains are away from the body, but not too far. We have to explain why that is, because basically were humans involved in moving your remains? And so we have to make an assessment of why those remains are moved. From the police perspective, they don't really care if coyotes came in or slope wash moved it down the hill. Yeah, that doesn't really matter, because they're concerned with how humans interacted with the evidence. Because ultimately, you know, they may try to say, hey, Joey was involved with this. He came back later, moved the remains, etc. And so we have to try to separate out the natural from the unnatural, the human induced part of it. We can use, we assess the scene from the perspective of what we call forensic taphonomy. Forensic taphonomy is basically the study of what happens to a body from the time of death and emplacement on a scene to recovery. So that interval is called the forensic taphonomic interval. For the police, they're not that concerned about the, you know, what's happening in between from a natural perspective. If animals come in and move it, doesn't really matter. They're only concerned with, did humans come in? You know, did somebody come in a month later and try to pick up the skull and say, oh, somebody may figure out who this is by removing the skull or putting it somewhere else. But we are, as we're trying to separate out natural from human induced evidence. So we will, with this forensic archaeology and forensic taphonomy background, we'll clear the scene and then document the remains from a number of different perspectives. We will map it. In this case, we will use what we call a hand-drawn map. You can see them taking measurements here, set up a baseline and map it. I'll show you some maps in a little bit. Excuse me. We will also use the more sophisticated mapping instrumentation to map exactly where everything is very precisely relative to the surrounding scene. And then ultimately with GPS coordinates, figure out where we are on the global scale. And then we can gather more information from these other databases, the geographic information system databases. And so this is a general protocol. Anytime we go to a scene, we will do these things, and that will allow us to note very carefully how the body is positioned, oriented, located, etc. And so at the end of that, we produce spectacular hand-drawn maps. And if we go to this one over here, you can see that it may be a little difficult to get that to be entered into court. It's you know, it's showing a human individual in the state of decomposition, you know, and if the family's in the audience, etc. However, we do a hand-drawn map, and you can see that is pretty palatable to everybody. You know, it doesn't look like Fred Smith there, but it shows how the remains are distributed, and then it illustrates what we're going to talk about. That this appears that this individual sat down at the scene, maybe did whatever, took some drugs, etc., expired, and then his appearance here is as if he had just died there, and then that's how we found him about a year later. Here are some of the other types of cases, and every one that we go to at the outdoor scene, we will do a hand-drawn map, and it provides fodder for our hypotheses of what happened in the past. So we're known for these maps. And then once we get it back to the laboratory, then again, we're very good with the bones. We can identify every single tiny little bone of the hands and feet, etc., to say, what are we missing? What do we have present? And then in terms of what we call the biological profile, we can look at a lot of different areas of the skeleton. You know, if we have the pelvis, we have information from the pubic bones there as to whether it's a male or a female, approximate age. We can look at the ribs, we can look at the skull, we can look at a whole bunch of things. We've spent the last 100 years or so, 100.5 years, trying to figure out from a bone what information we can get out of that, and we're very good at that. So the biological profile is an important part of it, but some of these bones may be missing, some of them may be altered and damaged, and we have to explain that. And we explain it because we recovered it and we have an understanding of the context of it. So we can explain why it's missing. It's not that the hands were cut off or anything like that. It's just that you know, the water runoff took it away, or some animals took it away. And then also another important part of it is the skeletal trauma. That's probably becoming the biggest area of forensic anthropology in the laboratory, where we know human bones, we know how they're altered, and then we can provide some details of those alterations. For example, in this bone of the head of the femur here, there is an indication that somebody tried to saw it off to basically dismember this part of it from the rest of the body. They weren't quite successful, but from that cut, that what we call a kerf, you can get some idea of the striations. Will tell you what type of blade was used, what direction they were sawing, how the body was positioned when they were trying to dismember the body. We can look at cuts from a knife and tell from the knife whether from the cuts whether it was a serrated knife or you know, double-sided, etc. So there is a lot of information from the bones there, still resident. You know, getting some information on the type of tool and the type of trauma that was inflicted upon this individual. Down here, we can see that there's a gunshot. We can tell that this is an entrance and this is an exit, and we can tell the direction and orientation, etc. If there was another gunshot, we'd be able to tell the sequence, which one was first, which one was second. Even from this, we might be able to get some information on the approximate caliber of the bullet. So there's a great deal of information, and you know, again, in the laboratory, we gather a lot of information from the bones, and I would say we're the best at extracting that information from the bones. And so when we produce the final report, we will talk about the scene recovery and the bones in the laboratory, etc. Then there is the last part of it. It is an interpretation of what we found there. And if we focused only on the bones, we'd say, oh, we found bones of a white male, 30 to 50, stood 5'6" to 6 foot, etc. There's some evidence of a gunshot to the head, and there you go. But then the police will say, well, we brought you there, and so they have other questions. How long has the body been there? If we just looked at the bones in the laboratory, this box of bones, said, well, was it buried? Was it above ground? You know, what type of environment is there in the area? What type of carnivores and scavengers are there, etc. So there are a lot of components of that we can't answer. You know, why are some missing? If the police have gone and just taken a few pictures and collected the material and then brought it eventually to us, then these are questions that we can't answer anymore scientifically, because again, the context has been lost. And so we always go back to, we need a proper scene recovery to collect the context. So that's how I see the field of forensic anthropology. So if that is the case, and we're called into it, and it's not just about the bones, so we can say something about the manner of death when we're dealing. Typically, the manner of death is assessed by the coroner or the medical examiner. That is based on what the police say, what the forensic experts say, et cetera. So it's a compilation of all of that information. In the past, when we just had the bones in the laboratory, all the forensic anthropologists say, well, we don't say anything about manner of death. That's not our area. But I will argue that if we're familiar with the scene and how the body's positioned and oriented, then yes, we can provide a significant contribution to that assessment, better than the forensic pathologist who doesn't have any soft tissue, et cetera. The same with the cause of death. If we're dealing with just skeletal material, the forensic pathologist doesn't have a whole lot to say about it. And so we take on an added role at the outdoor scene, and especially if it's significant decomposition or skeletonized. And then certainly when we're there at the scene applying forensic archaeological methods, we're the ones that are providing these details about events surrounding the death. And so we can see that the addition of forensic archaeology and the addition of forensic taphonomy is critical to the proper analysis, interpretation of the outdoor scene. There really isn't any other discipline that provides even close to what we would do by adding forensic anthropology. So we have recently looked at, and I've been doing this for 30 years, adding forensic archaeology to the outdoor scene. And we have the methodologies and protocols, et cetera. But what I realized probably about 5 or 6 years ago, are we collecting all of the information? Do we have the proper perspective? We would go to the scene and say, let's clear it. Let's get a spectacular map out of it and then go back. But then a few months after the fact, we're thinking about, what happened there? Why is this bone 20 feet away? Can we explain that? And then after the fact, it's very difficult to do that. And so in the last few years, I've changed my perspective, and it is when we're at the scene, we need to be presenting hypotheses of what occurred and testing those while we're there. And so hypothesis testing becomes very important. And so when we leave the scene after our recovery, we've already addressed them. There may be a few things that we have to extract from the laboratory analysis of the bones and other evidence, but for the most part, we've tried to figure out most of what happened in the past while we're there at the scene. And that's where the forensic taphonomy comes into play. When we go to the scene, we have the forensic archaeology, we have the tools and the trowels and things like that. But what we've been training the students and how we approach the scenes now is also in our toolbox, we have to have this forensic taphonomy. There are a series of questions that we need to address every time we go there. And so what the forensic and basically the logic of it is that when we're called into the scene, we're starting off as an academic institution. We have a master's degree and an undergraduate program in forensic science and forensic anthropology. But then sort of on the side, we're called in, like we were last week, we're called into this situation. So we're basically now leaving the academic part and operating in this forensic jurisprudence realm. When we're called to the scene, what is expected of us? So we'll look to the police and say, what questions do you have? And so we know what the questions are. They're going to say, A, is this human? And if it's human, what is it doing there? How did it get there? How long ago did it get there? Is there any evidence there of who did this? Even from the perspective, is this evidence of a homicide or a suicide or something else? We're taking a look at that. Even from the concept, from the police, is this a homicide or a suicide? What is going on? Often in an outdoor setting, that's a question that they're not quite sure of. And so that's what we're gonna bring to it. Because if it's a homicide, other humans are involved, and that's what the police are interested in. And so we have to understand that. This isn't just an academic pursuit of, yes, we're very good at identifying that tiny bone of the hand. Said, why are you calling us? We need to try to address all of those questions. And if it is a homicide, it'll likely end up in court. So we have to collect that evidence properly, scientifically, et cetera, so that it will be entered into the court. And so it's a different realm than just saying, well, we have some bones here, you're good at the bones. We're coming into this forensic case from a different perspective. So the forensic taphonomy, again, is what's happened to the body after death. And so we're going to focus on a couple things. That perspective will allow us to reconstruct what happened at the time of death. And then the interval after that until we recover it. So our job is to reconstruct that. There's, again, nobody else out there, the forensic pathologist, the coroner, the cops who are going to deal with that. So that's where forensic anthropology comes in. And we understand that the police and the coroners are interested in the human role at the time of death, who was involved in it, how were they killed, how were they deposited, did they try to hide the evidence, et cetera. And then somewhere down the road, did they try to come back and alter it? And so that's what I see as forensic anthropology. We're going to address those questions. So how do we reconstruct the past? We approach it scientifically, and in essence, when we're on in the field, we're going to construct and test hypotheses. And so it requires evidence from the field and in the laboratory. Some of the questions at every single case that we go to is, what's the time interval? How long has this body been there? We're going to be asked that every single time. And so we go in knowing we're going to collect evidence relative to that. So this thing last week, there is a set of remains. Just a little bit was exposed, but take a look at the skull. The skull is a bit weathered, so that gives me a rough estimate of how long ago this occurred. It wasn't 2 weeks ago. It probably was multiple years, et cetera. So what was the original location of that individual? Were they deposited there? Were they killed somewhere else? And then even how were they positioned and oriented? Because I look at it, somewhere down the road, if humans were involved, and even years from now, when they are called into court and say, what did you see? You were involved with it, et cetera. They will say, well, we deposited, and they won't say deposited, we dumped Bobby Joe here. He was face up, he had his cap on, his arms were under his body, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll have a story, and our job is, at the scene, can we reconstruct how that body was positioned and oriented at the time to compare in court for the jury? The other set of questions is what the police are going to provide. They're going to say, well, we have information that there were 3 people involved. And then this person did this to this person. They shot him or stabbed him or did something. And so they have a whole story. And so we need to hear what that story is, because we're going to test it. We're going to say, well, no, it wasn't 2 weeks ago. It was a couple years ago. No, they weren't shot. They were stabbed. Yes, they put it in a burial, et cetera. So there's a whole series of questions that we step on the scene that we're going to try to address. So I call this the forensic taphonomic approach. And so I'm going to give you a little example and show you a case, et cetera, and how we approach it. So this one, somebody was walking down the trail and saw what they thought were human remains. They called the police. The police investigated. They found remains. They called me, showed me a picture, said yes, those are human remains. Then the coroner is involved. They're in charge of the body in a given jurisdiction. So the police investigated, and by the time we arrived on the scene, they had a story. They said, well, we think it's this person. They were killed according to the suspects or the stories that we got, 6 months ago. It was a June day. There was a drug deal. It went bad, and there were two other guys. They beat the potential victim up here that we think it is, beat him up, and then eventually shot him and then stabbed him and did whatever. They dragged him over the hill here. They thought maybe it was a good idea to burn him. They didn't realize that this was kind of difficult. And then they said, no, screw it. We're just going to dump him. And then they left. And their story was, no, I never went back to check on it. I hope they decompose into nothing, etc. And so we have a scenario, a hypothesis. And what I see is, okay, we're coming in, we're going to test all the different components of your story so that ultimately in court you say, well, this guy described this, and point by point say yes, no, yes, yes, yes. And so for the jury, they have a way to evaluate whether these guys are telling the truth or lying, or et cetera. So it's not an easy task. Okay, so part one is to evaluate. Yes, in fact, we do have human remains here. The coroner and the police are involved, and they have some hypotheses. They tell us, and so we note them and say, yeah, we'll test all of those components. And so upon first inspection, we have a set of remains, and rather than just going in and say, take a few pictures, put it into the body bag and say, we need to get at the bones, there is still a lot of information that we can see here. And you take a look at it, say, okay, it is a set of human remains fully exposed. Some of the things you want to look for is the clothing. Is there any clothing left? Here's a little close-up of it. Yes, there's some sandals, there's some socks, maybe some pants. There's some indication that the shirt is pulled up. Why would that be? The arms there, but then say, well, it appears that this individual was dragged. And if they were dragged, they were probably dragged by their feet, which would have then bunched up the clothing, which would have brought the arms over the head, and say, okay, let's note that. So there's some evidence, and we write down what the evidence is of how the body was moved. There is another location there that there's some burnt ground, et cetera, that the police identified and that we further investigated. That might be the place where they tried to burn him first, because they said they picked the place, used some lighter fluid, et cetera, didn't work, and then they just dragged him down the path and deposited him along the path. And we have evidence of that. If he were dragged from that location, be best dragged by his feet and dragged down. His arms and shirt would have been bunched up. He was thrown into the brush there, et cetera, and left to decompose, and hopefully wasn't found. So there's information there. There's some information, if I go back, of how long the body's been there. There is some bone exposed. From our research, from our anecdotal, from my experience, et cetera, it takes about 3 months or so in this climate to do that. And there's some tissue here in the abdomen. And so just a general snapshot gives us an idea that we tell the police, yes, this has probably been here 3 to 6 months, 3 to 9 months, something like that. So that they said, well, we thought it was so-and-so and they've been here 2 weeks. And we said, no, I don't think it's been there. Or they say, we think it's so-and-so and that occurred 5 years ago. Said, no, that's not possible either. And so we're giving them information in real time that helps direct their subsequent investigations. And so then the process again is clearing the area, making sure there's no hidden evidence. We cleared the leaf litter. We noted whether it was on top of the individual to give a rough PMI estimate. You can see we've cleared it, and then there's some evidence here that we've outlined. The dark soil compared to surrounding soil. What does that have to do with anything? What is that? That's actually the decomposition fluids that came out and stained the soil and killed the grass, etc. So that evidence gives us an idea that the body was there in that location and really wasn't moved much as it decomposed. If it started the decomposition and you have some decom fluid and then you move the body, then you would have evidence of that. And so we have pretty good evidence, and we assemble it as we're there to say that yes, they apparently dragged him down the path, dumped him there, and that's where he stayed. We don't really have evidence of animals even coming in and modifying him. And so we're trying to reconstruct the little history from the time that he was killed at the scene to the time he was brought down the path. They tried to set him on fire. Do we have evidence of that? And then they gave up, and then they deposited him here. And so we're testing all of that and gathering evidence. And so we have we do the mapping. We note all of this stuff here, and then you can see up the path here, most of his body was here, or her body was there, and then there's some evidence up here of darkly stained soil, and we assess that and say that's not decomposition, so the body wasn't there at that point, but that's evidence of fire. And so there is some evidence that there was an attempt at a fire. There's no burnt sticks or anything like that. So it was kind of a pathetic effort. They may have just thrown lighter fluid on it, but that information is also critical, that it wasn't much of an effort. And ultimately that's what they described, lighter fluid, see how it would do, and it didn't do anything. But we have evidence of that little activity. And then ultimately, produce the total station map, or I mean the hand-drawn map. From this picture, it's a good picture. We've cleared the vegetation, but you can't really tell where other stuff is. And so our hand-drawn map basically just focuses on the forensically significant material. And so this is, again, this may be difficult to present in court. This would not be. And this tells us all of the information that we need in terms of what kind of clothing and sandals, where was the soft tissue, what bone was exposed, etc. And then in the laboratory, collect more information on give us more details of how long the body was out there, which bones are exposed and the tissue, etc. So this is more give you an idea of how bodies decompose, and it's a very interesting process. You have some of the tissue that was exposed, it dried out, sort of mummified. Others became skeletal, etc. So we study every part of the body so that we can, not only for this case, but future cases, if we find another body out in the woods on the surface and it has a similar condition of the soft tissue to the bones, we can say, well, in this particular one, it was 5 months. So we would predict that if we find something similar, it would be in that range as well, given the same conditions. And And so all of that information is going into our estimate of the postmortem interval and our reconstruction of past events. We then look at the bones in the laboratory, look at how the bones have been modified by animals, by the sun, by the soil, consider the scene information, and we're building a story of basically the history of the body from the time of our recovery. We go back in time to as this person was deposited. And so given what we're able to reconstruct, the main goal is that we can go back in time and sort of figure out what the scene looked like 5 minutes after the suspects left. And so that's what I see the value of what we do. We're able to do that. I mean, I guess the assumption is that you can't do that, but we've shown over and over that we can do that. You know, we then analyze the trauma, characterize it, you know, for court presentation and testing. You know, they said this individual was shot. We didn't see that. They said he was stabbed. We might see some evidence of that. And so all of that information is gathered from our forensic archaeological recovery. So we're testing the hypotheses. We even have some evidence of was there some burning? They said that, and we in the laboratory you can see some of the socks are burned, the underwear is burned. So yes, there is, but it wasn't much of an effort. And so we instead of just bones, we're trying to get information even prior to what happened. Where did the death occur? Was he brought in dead, multiple individuals? Through this forensic archaeological recovery, we can answer that. We're going to answer questions about what the scene looked like. Again, 5 minutes after the suspect left the scene. And this effort is what I've termed outdoor crime scene reconstruction. At the indoor scene, it's called crime scene reconstruction. So me very cleverly, since we're outdoors, I said outdoor crime scene reconstruction. So it's basically, can we reconstruct, go back in time 5 minutes after everybody left, what did it look like? And we can do that in the vast majority, nearly 100% of the cases, we can do that pretty accurately. You know, where was the body? How was it position oriented? Did somebody try to hide evidence there? How long did it occur? And what are the details? And so for me, where forensic anthropology was often portrayed as just the bones in the laboratory, that's a very small part of it. And I say, that isn't what I do. I do something different. I may call it forensic anthropology, or maybe I need to call it something else, and maybe when the police call us, we do outdoor crime scene reconstruction. And so that key addition is forensic taphonomy, and the description is a scientific analysis and interpretation of the outdoor scene. So it encompasses that. And you will notice that it doesn't really have, we analyze the bones for the biological profile. Okay, that's part of it, but the key thing is what we're providing for the police. And so that's my story. I don't want to, it's 12:25 here. I don't want to run over my time. So hopefully it wasn't too hasty. I wanted, if there were some questions there, questions about that, I can address that. If you want more information, a few years ago started a little training company on the side here. It's called HD Forensics, and we have, I've done a lot of in-person forensic archaeology courses for students, for law enforcement, et cetera. And then with the pandemic, we did a whole series of online things, which I turned out very well. I was also thinking of a sort of an in-person mystery writers course where you guys that are interested could come in and you know, touch and feel and smell the bones and smell decomp, and we can show you, you know, how we process these scenes. So if you think that might be of interest, maybe let me know and I could plan something for the next summer. So, but
Cool.
anyway, does anybody have any questions or were there some questions?
Yes, we do have. Thank you, Dennis. That was so interesting. Do you mind? Go ahead and stop sharing your screen.
Okay. Yes, sorry.
Perfect. No, you're fine. Okay, so it sounds like, at least in your area, we're going, the body's found, police are called, police call the coroner, and then they may or may not call you. Is that what we're looking at?
Well, in Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio, they will call me.
Oh, you're the
so-
expert.
Yes, I'm one of the few in the country, other than the students that I've sent out. But for the most part, it's still pretty 1970, where there's a body, the police say, there's really not a whole lot of information. So take a picture, take it into the morgue. And so I've been, again, trying to proselytize that there is a lot of information there. You apply forensic archaeology, you analyze it and interpret it through forensic taphonomy, and this is what you can get out of it. I mean, it's been a slow process. I'll just keep plugging away.
Good for you.
Recently, I was basically not hired, but there was a call for forensic anthropologists through the organization, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So I'm going to try to add this type of stuff to what they do. When they're called to a scene, a missing child or a potential child burial, we need to properly excavate that so that we can gather that information and then get a conviction.
Right. So it sounds like, so I'm in Utah, for example. So those of us who are in areas where we don't have a prominent forensic anthropologist, we're just SOL, right? I mean, that's when it comes to crime scene recovery, those in your industry may not be involved, it sounds like.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a common thing. It
Okay.
shouldn't be. I had one of my products, one of my graduate students eventually got her PhD and was in Idaho, for example. And so as she moved there, they found out. And so she was doing a bunch of cases there. And so I think that's how it will have to occur, as my protege here go out and get a job, and then they notify the authorities, we can do this, then we can sort of spread that.
Gotcha. You're doing good missionary work. All right.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me, so what Sarah wanted to know, drug use, can you tell that from the actual bone itself if you don't have any teeth left?
But that's a difficult one. You can, if it hasn't been too long, then you might be able, it depends on the drugs and stuff like that, if they're deposited. Bone is both organic and inorganic, and that's where the red blood cells are formed. Excuse me. So potentially, yes, you get a sample, and depending on the chemical analysis of it, you might be able to. We don't do a whole lot of that. And I don't know, there's a whole lot of research, but again, well, there's an area of research that we need to explore. That's a good question.
All right. If anybody wants to get a graduate school degree, go visit.
Yeah, and there's an interesting side note to that forensic entomology have been involved with that. They collect the bugs that are eating the flesh that have consumed the drugs, and they're able to profile some of the chemical alterations there through the maggots and such. So yes, and you would think that it would be maybe long-term use, maybe would be deposited in the bones, etc. So yeah, interesting.
That's fascinating. Okay, let's talk about gun calibers. We're looking at the size of the hole. Is that what it is? How do you tell? Okay.
Yeah, it would be basically, I mean, you have in individuals with a little thicker bones of the skull, if the bullet hits it perpendicular and not really at an angle, well, even in an angle, it creates a hole.
Mm-hmm.
And then you measure that. You can't say exactly the caliper, but you can give a range. say
Sure.
this isn't a 36, it could be a 22 or something like that.
Mhm.
And you know, again, with all of this, we present it as a hypothesis. So
Sure.
here's the measurement. It's possible it's in this range of measurement. So, you know, when I'm testifying, they say, Dr. Dirkmaat, is it possible that this was a 22 caliber bullet? And said, yeah, that would fit into the range. So that's how it's presented.
Okay, so I've got a quick question about, you said you may not be able to submit the evidence of the actual photograph of the body and at the site. And is that because it might be construed as inflammatory, thus you're having the hand-drawn map?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. In
Okay.
our final report that we give to the police and the coroner and all that, we have that in there. But and the hand-drawn map allows us to present the forensically significant information without the background noise. So it serves a couple different purposes, but ultimately, and when I testify, I have a report. And so nowadays it's basically, Dr. Dirkmaat, can you just go through your report and do that? And so there may be images in there, and we would include some of those of, you know, the actual body, and it would be up to the judge and, you know, the agreement there. So
Okay.
it hasn't been an issue in the past, but you know, just in case we would have that drawing, and it also allows me to say, here is what we found on the scene.
Okay, good to know. So going back to, you know, we're always interested in methods of, you know, trauma, basically. So if we're talking about blades and directions of cuts, or whether they're left-handed or right-handed, that's all something that that's part of your report, correct? And how would you tell those things?
Right. Well, like in a dismemberment case, for example, by looking at where the cut is, you would have to imagine or construct how the body was positioned. Was it face up and they're sitting over the body and they're sawing like from the outside to the inside? So yeah, there's some of that speculation and hypothesis. So that would be for some of the dismemberment cuts, etc. If we're talking about knife wounds and things like that, you know, the one that I showed you, almost all of those were from behind. And so, you know, that would be the main take from that the person was stabbed from behind. Now, we can't really tell unless there's some other evidence, whether they were on the ground and they were doing that, or they were standing and attempting to do that, or being held up. You know, we don't want to go too far beyond the evidence, but what we're doing is looking, you know, say, okay, we can say it's all posterior to anterior direction. If we had some other information on the ground and say, okay, then it looks like most of them were on the ground. And so it's a construction of a series of bits of evidence to build up our story. And that's the main thing. When we go to the scene, there is a lot of information, a lot of evidence, and we have to ensure that we collect it. And so I train the students, and it's not just me looking at stuff and evaluating, it's everybody that's involved in the recovery is thinking about it. I encourage them, what do you see? If you see something, tell the person taking the notes, even if it's ultimately it doesn't pan out, but your observation is important. We may have 20 other people that observe something different, but that clue may be important down the road.
Okay, so you commented historically with the profession. I know Joanne was asking a little bit about this. So you said in the 1970s, there wasn't, people would just collect the bones and go. Same thing, 1950s. I mean, what happened with buried bodies and mass grave?
Well, prior to forensic archaeology, and forensic archaeology, we can say, is probably from, I started in the 80s. With my background, I looked into who was doing it. Very few individuals were doing it. I won't say that I'm sort of a pioneer in it, but I guess I am, because since I have that background, and every time I give a talk, I say forensic archaeology, to the point that the discipline, the section in the American Academy of Forensic Sciences used to be called the physical anthropology section. And so since I started, I said that tells everybody that we only deal with bones. So we need to change the name. And so about 6-8 years ago, they said, Dennis, you think so? Then you test it out. Poll the forensic anthropologists, see if that's important still. And they overwhelmingly, they at least mouthed it and said, yes, Al, that's very important. So we changed the name to just anthropology. And by doing that, we could bring in archaeology, which is a subfield of anthropology. We could bring in archaeology, yes.
Yeah.
But prior to that, you didn't have forensic anthropologists. The cops just went to a burial, and there's lots of pictures of them with pickaxes and shovels and backhoes and just get it out because it was assumed there really wasn't any information. And so, yeah, you cringe when you look at evidence, how things were done before then. But in historical hindsight, yeah, it probably wasn't done very well. I mean, maybe all of investigations, we see the O.J. Simpson as a break point, but it wasn't done very well prior to that, and it, in many cases, it's not really done well after that point. We don't see on TV shows that when they find a body, they roll it over, pull out the wallet, and say solved. We don't see that anymore, thankfully. They document it, don't touch it, etc. So, but what we're doing is say, do the same thinking at the outdoor scene. Because now said, oh, well, indoors, it's sitting on pavement, we don't move it, but it's outdoors, take a few pictures, put it in the body bag. So.
But there are just as many clues outdoors. That's
Yeah.
great. Okay, let me get to two questions that are particularly, I think, pertinent for the writing world. So reading novels, you always have the story where you've got the rookie investigator who shows up at a scene like this. There's some decomp and he throws up in the bushes, and the veterans totally. Lee, that was a great question. The veterans not bothered at all. What does it look like when you're out with your students? Is that a thing? Is that for real?
No, not for my students, because we're involved with decomposing remains all the time and skeletons, and we also receive donations of individuals that want to donate their bodies to science. So they're in our morgue, basically processing. And so when they go to the scene, that's not a factor. I mean, I've had only one student who wanted to get into the field of forensic anthropology that she didn't follow through, because I had a case where there was a fire in a cabin of like teenagers. They were at a retreat and a fire, and multiple individuals died. And I was involved in trying to figure out the age and, some of the biological profile, and she was helping me. And it wasn't so much, oh, this is disgusting, et cetera, but it was, she started thinking about how the person died, and, sort of that empathy factor came in. She was thinking about it, and, maybe partly mourning, et cetera. And then she said, I can't do that. And so that's one thing that I learned early on is like from plane crashes, for example. You can't go in there and say, oh my God, how these people died, that's unbelievable. And, you have to think along those terms. You can't. You have to think about it. My job, my benefit to the families is to try to get an ID, to do the best job of handling the remains, and certainly with respect, but to, determine the trauma, determine how they died, and some other things. It's not, I'm not the one that should be in charge of mourning. Yes.
Sure.
I don't know if it sounds cold, but that's
how
sort of how it is. You have to do that. Because I was involved in a plane crash down in Pittsburgh. And so I would go home afterwards and watch the news, and then they would have all these sad stories and you'd feel bad. And one day I was involved with taking the ring off of a finger and reading the inscription and writing it down. And then that day there was a song that sort of represented the whole affair, and it was from this guy, and said, okay, I can't do that. I can't every day read the papers, etc. So
Right.
that's how I handled it.
So so it sounds like you don't necessarily have a body farm, but you do have a lab where you've got bodies that are decomposing and such, right?
Well, we have a sort of a morgue where we can process human remains. So most
Okay.
of the time, you know, it's another fallacy that as forensic anthropologists, you only deal with bones. Well, we deal with all sorts, and probably 1% of the cases is just skeletal. The other 99% has some soft tissue, so we're dealing with that. And so we have a morgue facility where we can document, X-ray, photograph, and then basically remove the soft tissue so that we can look at the 100% of the bone surfaces. And then we have a cooler facility where people have donated their body, and so they're there awaiting our processing. So yeah, it's not, they're not decomposing inside or anything like that.
Okay. Okay. So how long does it take? Let's say that example you gave us, the person who was, I guess, shot or stabbed and dragged by their feet. How long did it take to process that scene as compared to how long does it take to do a mass trauma event to process one of those?
Well, for all of our cases, I have the luxury of bringing my graduate students. So we often roll up in 2 vans of 15 to 20 individuals who are, so it becomes a well-oiled machine. And so it's always a day. It's always 5 to 8 hours, regardless of what it is, even if there's multiple individuals. The one last week, there were 2 individuals. We were there probably 7 hours total. So yeah, the application of forensic archaeology and all that certainly benefits. It's a much more efficient process when I can bring 15 experts with me that know what they're doing and do all the different tasks, multitasking and cross-trained and all that. And so, but then in the laboratory, you know, there's no rush to it, say, oh, we need it the next day. You would think that would be, but we said we need to document it very carefully. So that takes a while. And then the cleaning of the remains, it's not just, it's something akin to putting it into the pot of cooking water, not boiling it, but almost like, you know, cooking a chicken and deboning and stuff like that.
Right.
So that takes a while.
Sure.
And then the laying out of the skeleton and going over it, we take weeks to look at it. It's not like, okay, lay it out. I have my notes and we're done, produce the report. It is, I want everybody to look at it, sleep on it, think about it, come back the next day, look at it, sleep on it, and do that with many eyes, many days. And then at the end say, what do we have? And then people say, okay, we have this, or wait, email. I noticed this, is this significant, and et cetera. And so that way, when we produce a report, I know I'm very confident in what we're saying, that we have examined it the best that we can.
Okay, so I have 2 very quick questions, then we're going to take a 10-minute break before our next speaker. So number 1, in your area, police, I just want to confirm, police call the coroner and then the coroner calls you? Or does the police call the coroner and you at the same time?
Well, the coroner is in charge of the body.
Okay.
So in most of the situations, it will be the police investigating a scene. And then if they come upon a scene that somebody notified them, then they have to determine, is this a human? And do we need to start to investigate? So at that point, the coroner is not involved. For the most part, if we're dealing with bones, the coroner has no idea either.
Okay.
And so I will be called and maybe to evaluate the significance. Is this animal, is this human, et cetera. If I say it's human, then the police then will go and assist the police. But it's at that point, once you have confirmed the human remains, then the coroner has to get involved and do that. And so in various jurisdictions, maybe the coroner will say, well, when I don't need to be involved in this part. Yes, it is humans. I trust the cops to gather all the information that I would need. Or like in this one here in Chautauqua County, the coroner is intimately involved and working with the police, working with us almost every day. So it varies. It varies the jurisdiction. Like in Pennsylvania here, it's the coroners are elected. So you don't have to have any skills other than living in the county. Other jurisdictions, it's the medical examiner who has to be, like in Ohio, the coroners have to be medical doctors. Pennsylvania, they do not. You just have to live in the county. Or a medical examiner is typically a forensic pathologist with many years, et cetera, and they're appointed. So it's quite a bit different.
Okay, last question. How do we find out? So how do you tell race from a skeleton? Don't we all look the same inside?
Inside, yes, we're all humans,
Right.
but given
Sorry.
the
About-
circumstances of geography and all that and evolutionary forces, the shape and how we're constructed is a little bit different, evolutionary forces. And so we have measured a lot of skeletons, and so the changes are very subtle, but there are differences based on where you come from geographically. And so we talk about that as ancestry.
Okay.
And so one of the key things that I will say is that we don't call it race anymore. Race has too much racial overtones, et cetera. So we talk about sex, stature, ancestry. So it becomes ancestry. But it's, yes, we are all humans and we all have the same sort of features that we're just put together a little bit differently, but there's significant variation there. And so it's very subtle and it's not definitive. It's not like, okay, I see a skull, I say, okay, that person was white versus black versus whatever. That's not the case. We often have to do measurements and a probability statement and how typical are you of a given population that we've measured. And so, yeah, very tenuous. If we just find a skull these days, for me, in my experience, I probably will not, unless it's really clear, will not assign an ancestry to it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that information. That's really illuminating. Okay, well, we better wrap. I think we answered most of the questions. Really interesting. Yeah, bravo. That was super interesting.
Thank you.
Now I have more questions. I have about 4 or 5 more hours of stuff I want you to talk about. Another day, another time. Well,
Okay.
thank you so much, Dennis. That was fantastic. Those of you that are around, stick around. At the top of the hour, we have Dr. Michelle Miranda is coming in to talk about tattoos, specifically on corpses. So, okay, it's good Halloween talk.
I got something to say about that too. We did that recently, but
Very
anyway,
cool.
well,
That's
thank
great.
you, everybody.
Yes.
If you have any questions, feel free to write me or yes, Amanda can get you my email address, or I can always be contacted through our website, that hdforensics.com.
Perfect.
So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck. Yep. Bye.
Okay. If you all want, yeah, I'll let Michelle is just waiting to join us. And so if you guys need a bio break or something, do that. I'm going to stop recording for a second.